I will start. Welcome on this third panel in the series, The Usable Past, Constructing Regional Memory. And, our speakers today will be Susan Smith, a historian, independent scholar from Washington, D.C. She will talk about Russian Provincial Archival Commissions, collections, networks, and notions of expertise. Tyler Kirk, a historian from Arizona State University, a doctoral candidate, who will talk about Gulag Returnees, memory and regional identity in post-Soviet Russia, the Komi Memorial Archive. Then Victoria Donovan, an ethnographer from Scotland, from University of St. Andrews, will talk about, her talk will be entitled From Mounds of Friendship to Sacred Hills, Landscapes of Memory in the Russian Northwest, 1985-2015. And finally, Nadia Berkovich from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, from the Slavic department, also a doctoral candidate, will talk about where Makar didn't herd his calves, the Yakutified peasant in Korolenko's Siberian Stories. So we have these talks, and I would like to welcome our first speaker, Susan Smith, Russian Provincial Archival Commissions, collections, networks, and notions of expertise.
Good afternoon. Okay, so signed by Alexander III on April 13th, 1884, the Statute on Provincial Historical Archives and Learned Archival Commissions called for the creation of local archival and historical organizations to gather documents that were not being used by regional and district governance, and to organize, copy, describe, and preserve materials that they considered to be of historical interest. Funding for the commissions was to come from the Archaeological Institute, which had been established in 1877 in order to increase the number of archival and archaeological specialists and to improve the quality of their work. Funding rarely came from the Archaeological Institute in some cases. We'll talk about that in a bit. The statute called for commissions to be made up of state servitors and those not in service who could be useful either because of their knowledge or their zeal. And this is what I want to look at today. An individual, of course, could have both knowledge and zeal, but there was general recognition that those with, quote, knowledge were few in number, and that those that were interested really had to be encouraged to take part in this larger historical project. Indeed, the Committee of Ministers believed that the young and clerics might be particularly useful. The first group because of their energy, and the second group, quote, for their enlightenment and their love towards antiquity. Although the statute made the Ministry of Internal Affairs responsible for the creation of the archival commissions and opened the first four in 1884, the directive lacked any detailed timeline for its own implementation. Each group was responsible for working out its own internal organization, and because the Academy of Sciences hoped that the local enthusiasts would take part in archaeological digs and cataloging local monuments, the statute also stated that each organization should consider other scientific activities based on their local means and interests. In other words, the statute was relatively vague on many important points, and that vagueness is going to be recognized as a problem at the start of the 20th century when standardization becomes increasingly important. But at the local level, it meant that the enthusiasts and the local officials that formed the organizations had a lot of leeway in what they would be doing in their provinces. In May of 1898, the Ministry of Internal Affairs granted permission for the creation of the Vladimir Archival Commission. The activities of the group were largely going to be defined by a fairly high-ranking state servitor, Alexei Selivanov. He had been the organizer of the Ryazan Archival Commission and its first director of affairs, and he urged his listeners at the founding meeting of the Vladimir Group to combine the tasks of an archival commission with those of the archaeological society. In other words, he was using Ryazan as a model for Vladimir. He argued that the goals of the Vladimir Commission included the collection, preservation, and organization of local, regional, and family archives, the study and publishing of documents with historical significance, the study and writing about archaeological monuments, particularly as related to Vladimir Suzdal Krai, and the collection of antiquities with artistic or scientific meaning. Foundation of museum and library were also encouraged to provide institutional homes for these collected materials, and also to necessitate preservation and research. Essentially, he was arguing that the Archival Commission should serve as the keeper of the identity of the region. But it was more than that. It was also to promote this identity. At the first meeting, he had spoken of, quote, the energy with which many members of the commissions of Ryazan, Tver, Saratov, and other provinces worked and work, expecting and receiving nothing in return. Their civic activism suggesting their pride in their regions. It was due to this tireless devotion that museums arose in these other cities in a very short time, quote, as if by a miracle. These local museums and their huge scientific and educational significance undoubtedly present themselves as the most sympathetic and distinguished of all provincial establishments. Close quote. Disinterestedness and self-sacrifice served as the foundations for these useful and morally solid institutions, but scientific and educational significance had to be established. As was well understood, archival commissions used the selection and naming of honorary members to reinforce and expand their network of well-wishers, potential donors, and to introduce their work to scholars and well-known figures. More importantly, in the case of Vladimir, it was the 16th Archival Commission formed, so it immediately joined a cohort of archival commissions, a pre-existing network of institutions that reinforced and interacted with other networks of collectors and enthusiasts. So in addition to selling their trudi, containing both primary and secondary sources from their regions, the archival commissions routinely traded other publications with one another and with other learned associations. In Susan Crane's words, such journals served as mental meeting places, promoting broader scholarship and allowing researchers in different areas to talk indirectly to colleagues that they had probably never met. So indeed, with the founding in 1911 of the Irkutsk Archival Commission, there was even a sister organization east. The Vladimir Commission's handful of activists understood and appreciated the potential that such organizations driven by individual initiative held for worthwhile work. As Joseph Bradley has written, organizations such as archival commissions, which were self-regulating and in which membership was voluntary, offered their participants new forms of sociability and self-definition. Finding true participants, however, could be a daunting task. In a letter to Selivanov, Professor Alexei Markevich of Novorossiya University, with pessimistic tongue-in-cheek, wrote, "Here in Russia, it is possible to found any group desired, and money is easy to find. For this, you need only to find one fanatic, making a sacrifice and not a moment to lose in his interests. In this case, the society is already able to flourish. If there are two fanatics that get along, the affairs of the society will proceed brilliantly, even if the society has in mind only the most minimal or unrealizable goals. If there are three, well, please, I have never come across such a situation. But if there is not even one, even the most respected and materially well-off society will only drag out its existence." While this statement was, strictly speaking, not true, it does suggest that it would be difficult to overstate the importance of the moral support that knowing that such networks and other groups and individuals existed, that they were out there, could have. So beyond contributing to and benefiting from this community, the Archival Commission worked on a more tangible level. It gathered and studied artifacts of what Alain Confino has referred to as local national memory. Memory constructed to reconcile localness and nationhood. It carried out archaeological digs, held membership meetings, and of course considered archival commissions. It also started to work on creating a museum, recognizing, quote, all the difficulties of doing so, beginning without monetary means, without a convenient facility, but also recognizing the necessity and highest utility of the institution. Praskova Uvarova, the head of the Moscow Archaeological Society and honorary member of the Vladimir Commission, had written in 1890 in a piece called Oblast Museums, the government cannot help but agree that small local museums should be called to life, namely by private initiative, because for this undertaking it is necessary particularly to have an acquaintance with the locality and the local population, a particular love and devotion to this affair, energy in the work, and tirelessness. Clearly, this notion that perceived necessity was the mother of local virtue was widely held. The Vladimir Commission's museum opened in 1906 in conjunction with the Third Oblast Congress, both of them speaking to Vladimir's civic-mindedness and pride. Just as the Gubernia Archival Commissions represented areas delineated by contemporary administrative borders, the Oblast Historical Archaeological Congresses spoke to an older entity no longer in existence, namely the medieval principality. So the first Oblast Congress of the Researchers of History and Antiquities of Rostov-Suzdal Oblast was held in Yaroslavl over 5 days in August of 1901. When proposing the conference to the archival commissions in the cities that had been part of the Rostov-Suzdal lands, Nizhny Novgorod, Kostroma, Tver, and Vladimir, the Yaroslavl Archival Commission wrote, one of the most important tasks of contemporary Russian historiography is the full and detailed research of the history of individual Russian oblasti on the foundation of the study of monuments of antiquity, both material and written. The organizers called for the Congress to address the aforementioned provinces and sections of the Vologda, Tver, and Novgorod gubernia. The archive of the State Historical Museum has a very unusual and very interesting source on this conference. It's a scrapbook that an unidentified creator put together using newspaper reports and commentary that provide a glimpse into what people were saying about this conference in Yaroslavl. The newspapers generally considered the conference to have been a success, and they generally held that to understand better Russian history, you had to know the history of the provinces. The articles, however, made some other points as well. Several authors, for example, worried that the members of the archival commissions making decisions about preservation and carrying out the research were amateurs, or as some people wrote, dilettantes. One author, unfairly I think, wrote, if it is true that we will not know the history of Russia while we are without the history of the oblast, then it is no less true that we will not have the history of the oblast while the responsibility for the collection and preservation of local monuments lays on those who will not be guided in their researches by general scientific methods and generally do not prove to be at the height of contemporary scholarly historical knowledge. Another commentator, Arseny, who I believe was probably the Arseny who was the Archbishop of Kazan, was also concerned that the occurrence of such conferences might mislead people into believing that preservation was in competent hands. He did acknowledge, however, that the conference was more successful than anybody expected it to be, and he maintained that its significance was largely moral. In other words, the more of these conferences that were held, the more standardized practices would become, and the more legitimate the hands of the people working with the materials would be. Other writers that show up in the scrapbook commented on the fact that members of the general public had attended the Congress. This also seems to have been a bit of a surprise for some. For example, the author of the article from Government News noted that at the opening, a not small public of the middle class appeared. Many of the residents carried their own treasured objects of antiquity to the exhibit created by the Congress. Having come from all ends of the former Rostov-Suzdal Krai, modest provincial toilers, lovers of antiquity, insignificant accomplishers of a great work in the quietness of their forgotten corners, of the collection and protection of monuments of antiquity brought before the judgment of scientists, the results of their many years of work. In addition to the author's patronizing tone and the clear divide between locals and scientists, several other aspects are worthy of note. First, the most active of the modest provincial toilers, who I'm referring to as the amateur enthusiasts or the activists, were frequently precisely the types of people called upon in the 1884 statute. Members of the clerical estate and members of local educated society interested in their local histories. In the case of the Vladimir Commission, the commission that I know the best, all but one of the earliest activists were Popovici, fascinated by history. Second, the quote suggests that the activists of the Yaroslavl Archival Commission had successfully pitched the Congress as a worthwhile undertaking to a broader public than just their own members. Third, the antiquarianism and love of the local was paying off. It was having worthwhile results. The success of this novel approach to simultaneously expanding the base of knowledge about regional history and the audience for this research suggested that provincial amateur enthusiasts could in fact generate their own audiences and their own critics. This in turn would encourage improvement in their work. The historian Nikolai Chichulin and others commented on the debates spurred by most of the Congress's papers and found themselves hopeful for scholarship in the provinces. As one commentator noted, it may be that it is quite unnecessary to wait. Local activists will certainly be the future historians of the Krai. As the gathering in Yaroslavl had been highly successful, the Tver, Vladimir, and Kostromov fought it out to host the second. Tver won, and the Congress was also deemed a success. The Vladimir organizers got the privilege of organizing the third Congress, and in their petition to hold the Congress in 1905, they argued that these gatherings were a natural step in the development of archival commissions. Moreover, they noted that meetings of the Congress will be freely open for all and every, giving the possibility of all interested here, so to speak, in their own home, to hear leading and talented representatives of historical archaeological knowledge who have cultural power and are able to awaken interest in the native past and advance provincial energies towards historical archaeological research. Cultural power presumably rested on expertise, academic affiliations and relations, and the resulting roles and authority of the individuals within a broader sphere. The argument that some individuals had cultural power, of course, suggests that others did not. Presumably those without the power were the members of the general public and the provincial amateur enthusiasts. The state clearly recognized and defined cultural power, although they did not use the term. When applying to host the Oblast Congress, which would be postponed until 1906, the Vladimir Commission had received permission from the Ministry of Internal Affairs to host the Congress, but it had received permission from the Ministry of Public Enlightenment or Education to invite certain scholars. In other words, they had to be cleared to bring specialists into the provincial setting to interact with members of the public. So on June 20th, 1906, the chairman of the Congress, Nikolai Pokrovsky, the director of the Archaeological Institute, kicked off events with a speech in which he recognized the importance of these congresses. He also addressed the close relations between, if not conflations of, notions of science, disinterestedness, and truth, and the meaning of the nation. Having remarked that the work of the archival commissions had animated archaeological research in the Oblast, Pokrovsky added, "Finally, to this archival commission, in the person of its foremost activists, we are obliged for the current archaeological congress. Due to the inexhaustible energy of the commission, the tasks of the Congress have been made easier. In its work, the Congress already moves along a planned path, and its tasks come to this: to facilitate, where possible, the work of local activists, to help them investigate a large amount of valuable material, widen to the degree possible their scholarly horizons, and of particular importance, to encourage the disinterested and modest toilers to new feats of service to national science, which shows the straight path to truth, and to animate in local enlightened society an interest in its native antiquity, the knowledge of which comprises the base of true enlightenment and helps make out the path of the future." Pokrovsky's tone, I think, shows the genuinely appreciative attitude of professionals towards the activists. Nevertheless, while the relationship was beneficial mutually, Pokrovsky clearly understood the role of the Congress as a paternal one towards the provincial researchers. Moreover, he acted on this belief throughout the sessions, offering comments and information on further reading, so forth, to the local activists. Now, chosen for their roles At a meeting of the organizing committee on the day before the opening of the Congress, the leading of lights of science, such as Pokrovsky, worked to organize the schedule of Congress sessions with 2 local scientific secretaries, both of whom were Popovici, both of whom were teachers at the local seminary, and both of whom were at the heart of the Archival Commission. And while the papers that this group selected were diverse, the scholarly practices were the same in each session. Again, we're looking here for regularity, for standardization. The first session, which addressed Oblast history, immediately set the pattern for discussion and debate. Papers themselves entered into discussions with earlier scholarship. While the vast majority of papers were given by non-academics, it was the academicians and respected and recognized specialists that gave most of the responses. They were most likely to dispute arguments and evidence. Provincial authors, regardless of how well published or respected, were much less likely to comment, and when they did, they commented on their fellow provincial specialists. The only session that provincial activists dominated was that on prehistoric antiquities, and I believe this probably relates to the relative ease with which the locals could undertake archaeological digs, unlike those from the capitals and the bigger cities. Now, this is not to imply that the division between the group that I'm calling amateur enthusiasts and the scholars was a clean one. I think it was rather a continuum. The scholars had more advanced formal training. They generally had an institutional base. Their interests were more likely to range over broader geographical fields, and their work was more likely to be written for academics and sometimes for broader public. Moreover, they worked as scholars. With the exceptions of the retired or the very wealthy, the amateur could only undertake the work during his, and it was generally men, his free time. The interests were more likely to be locally situated, the work more likely to be dispersed locally through local publications, to locals, enthusiasts in other regions, and sometimes scholars. And although there is no practical way to determine what type of education provincial enthusiasts had, many of them in Vladimir, and presumably in other regions with ecclesiastical educational institutions, had gone through the seminaries and then into ecclesiastical academies. As far as I can tell, in Vladimir, there was only one amateur enthusiast who had any sort of professional training, what would pass as professional training in a year in the Archaeological Institute. And his name was Neofit Malitsky. He was one of the scientific secretaries. Okay, and in part because relatively little has been written on cultural and philanthropic activities in the provinces, there is little scholarship on notions of experience-based expertise, or experience-based knowledge in the provinces and how these practices developed. And yet this type of knowledge is absolutely critical to these provincial organizations, and I think needs to be studied further. Clearly, the participants of the Congress recognize themselves as part of a larger community of shared interests in which everybody could contribute, even if the involvement carried different levels of authority. The provincial researchers recognized that they were provincial in the eyes of the urban scholars, and they generally accepted this status. In part because the proximity to the sources, archival, archaeological, architectural, and historical, constituted their one great advantage. This is what they had going for them. As the professionals demonstrated, they valued the work of the local enthusiasts. Unfortunately for the amateur enthusiasts driving the Vladimir Archival Commission, this appreciation would come to feel like an aberration. After 6 years of planning, fundraising, and construction, the Archival Commission opened its museum just in time to host the Third Oblast Congress. The end of the Congress, however, meant that many of the objects that had been lent returned to their homes, leaving a lot of work to be done on the collection and regular display. As most of the obvious donors had already been approached to support the Congress, raising money became much harder. And most importantly, I think the end of the Congress left the commission and its museum without a clearly defined target audience, the Vladimir public being much more dispersed than scholars and other enthusiasts. The amateur enthusiasts would continue their work through 1918. They were frequently disheartened. And I think this discouragement that they felt paved the way just a bit for their working with the Bolsheviks actually after the nationalization of the museum and their archives. Thank you.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for having me and putting on this awesome conference. It's very interesting. So to start off, really quick, I just would like to share a little anecdote that's taken from the news of late. Actually, already a couple weeks old. But I'm sure most of you know that one of Russia's only preserved Gulag camps, Perm 36, as a museum, was recently, it wasn't closed, but transitioned from, not ownership, but being run by the Memorial Society into local regional government. And it's totally radically transformed the exhibit, which was once about the Gulag victims and political repression, and is now more about people who ran the camps and worked in the camps. People in Komi, in the Komi Republic, which I'm going to talk about a lot today, picked up on this. And a newspaper, Krasное Знамя Севера, recognized this as a great chance for Komi to become the next center of memorial tourism in all of Russia. And they said, quote, that Komi itself is one big museum under the open sky and the heart of the Gulag system. And that this closure of Perm 36, while very tragic and sad, is a chance for Komi to become a tourist destination. So with that being said, with that being in mind, you can see that the Gulag is something that descendants and living survivors don't just think about, but it's something that's in the public historical consciousness of the Komi Republic. It's a very important part of Komi's history. So with that being said, we'll get started. All right. So this paper examines the role of memory and history in the making of regional identity in the Komi Republic. Formerly repressed narratives of the Gulag are an important and large part of Komi's history and regional identity, which pushes back against historical narratives, or the usable past, emanating from Moscow that downplay the Gulag and whitewash Stalinist repression. I argue that the legacy and memory of the Gulag and victims of political repression are essential components of the regional identity of the Komi Republic. Evidence of this entangled nature of the history of the Gulag, Komi's regional identity, and memory can be seen in the formation of a Komi Memorial Archive, so a chapter of the Memorial Society in the Komi Republic, of which there are many, but CENTRIFUGAL being the main base of operation. Gulag returnees' memoirs and local monuments, as well as regional officials and obviously local journalists' comments that refer to the Komi Republic as formerly one big camp under the open sky. Okay, so I'm sure most of you know, but I'm used to explaining to people where Komi is. So the Komi Republic is, you can see there's Moscow, there's Vorkuta, and this kind of rail line right here between Moscow and Vorkuta, and connecting the CENTRIFUGAL. It was built by Gulag forced labor, and that is the Russian region of the Komi Republic. Also, this map is a good example of some of the work that the Memorial Society does generally in Russia, but also the Memorial Society in the Komi Republic has also contributed a lot of information, archival information, and putting together maps like these to demonstrate the extent of the camps throughout Komi. And this is just to give you another good sense of Komi, CENTRIFUGAL, city on the Sisla down there. Okay. So, formerly known as the Komi SSR, Komi Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, now the Komi Republic, was once one of the most densely populated epicenters of the Gulag archipelago. As such, it offers a unique and diverse group of subjects who, when Glasnost was implemented, actively participated in sharing their own stories in memoirs and letters written to local newspapers and to the Memorial Society, as well as contributing to local archives and the National Library of the Komi Republic. Okay. So before I jump into the analysis of these, a couple of examples of these Gulag returnee memoirs, I'd like to share with you what I've referred to several times now as the state narrative of the past, or the Moscow narrative, or one version of that narrative. So obviously contending with this legacy of political repression and the Gulag has never been a popular nor easy task in Russia. despite several attempts to do so under Khrushchev, the Soviet period, under Gorbachev, and then again under Yeltsin, and sort of that process being brought to not a halt, but more of a crawl since 2000. One of the examples that I've chosen to highlight as this sort of official narrative coming from Moscow comes from a teacher's manual and school children's history textbook, which downplays the role of the Gulag in Soviet history and its role in the construction of Soviet industry and society, and labels Stalin's leadership as an effective managerial position. So in this formulation, the Gulag essentially becomes almost a non-entity and a distant, unrelated chapter of Soviet and Russian history. And this is a narrative that Komi Gulag Returnees and the Komi Memorial project are also trying to write against, as I'll argue. So, Komi Memorial Archive. So, as a former center of the Gulag, Syktyvkar, the capital city of the Komi Republic, has its own branch of Memorial, which was founded in 1998 by members of the community, including among them Gulag returnees and descendants of those who were sent to Komi in exile and continued to live there after that. Memorial Syktyvkar has collected oral histories, memoirs, letters, and compiled lists of prisoners, special settlers, and places of confinement throughout the Republic. In addition to creating this archive that I've referred to as Fond Pokayania, the Repentance Fund, their project is conducted by local historians with the aim of historical documentation and of the history of the Gulag, in addition to the preservation of a collective memory of political repression, as they call it, in the Komi Republic, which, as again I argue, forms a large part of their regional identity. The majority of the memoirs that I have looked at through this collection for my own dissertation research were sent to and collected by Memorial from roughly 1998 through 2012. Most of them are published either through, well, a majority of them are published through the Martyrolog, the Martyrology, which is a kind of Kniga Pamyati, a book of memory that Memorial Syktyvkar has put together, containing the list of names, and including memoirs and documents from the Komi National Archive. But also these memoirs are also available in hard copy in the National Library, but also as, if you go to Memorial Syktyvkar, they have little CD-ROM discs so that you don't have to take this 9-volume series with you home, which is tough. I've done it. I got strong in Syktyvkar. But more importantly, what I'm trying to say is that these materials are available and read in the Komi Republic. All right. So I've mentioned memory several times, and as a part of this greater archival project in the project of commemorating the legacy of the Gulag and the Komi Republic, I see the Martyrolog and the collection of memoirs and the creation of lists and the erection of monuments. We'll leave monuments aside for a second, but the collection of these textual sources as soft sites of memory, which present a discourse that shapes regional identity, as well as gives a voice to these bronze, stone, and wood monuments, which we will talk about a little bit later. So an important sort of background context to the memoirs that I'll give as an example here in just a second. Everybody's familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which documents the history of the Soviet state apparatus of repression and the Gulag, in addition to describing everyday life in the camps, which also draws, much like the Martyrolog, from memoirs and other more unofficial types of primary sources. But more importantly, the Gulag Archipelago, and this is particularly pertains to memoir writers, presents a narrative that shapes how the Gulag experience is represented and elevates Solzhenitsyn's reportage to the level of history. This form of memoir history allows for the use of memory as a supplement to the meager archives that document the world in which the Gulag prisoner once lived. Also, memoir history transforms individual memory into a textual monument itself that forms its own archive and posits a counter-narrative that contributes to the formation of collective memory. But however, more importantly, despite the role of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in shaping how individuals address their own memories and tried to represent them in memoirs, Gulag returnees from Komi share many similarities among themselves. Okay. Most importantly, these memoirs emphasize the importance of the Gulag in the development, the construction of infrastructure, and the growth of cities in the Komi Republic. And specifically, they also identify this with the Russian North. So the importance of the Gulag as a component of the development of the Russian North. They also document individual suffering in the camps and sort of present an individual narrative of arrest, sentencing and exile, and then their life afterwards. But the most important part I found in reading through these memoirs is that they don't just present the Gulag as the penultimate of their life experience. It is but one chapter in their own personal history. And so they're also presenting it as one chapter in the history of the Komi Republic. However, albeit a very important chapter that is dramatically shaped what was once a ethnically singular republic in the Russian North under the Tsars and early Soviet power, which became forever changed by the importation of different nationalities to the Republic who were sent there as prisoners and exiles. Okay, finally, whoops, okay. Sorry, just teasing you. So for the memoir that I would like to talk about, or one of them, was written by a man named Leonid Pavlovich Markizov, who was arrested in 1945. And after stops in several prisons and small camps, he arrived in the Komi Republic on May 15th, 1951, where he lived out the rest of his life as a freedman after he was released. Markizov's memoir is interesting because it attempts to normalize his story as the biography of a Soviet man rather than as simply a Gulag prisoner. He writes his memoir he includes in his memoir his arrest and deportation from Harbin, China. It includes his life in the Gulag and his work history after the camp. He was a very proud engineer who worked in the Vorkuta oil mining complex in the Komi Republic. However, the significant part, and just to underscore what I said previously, and the key component of his memoir is that he weaves the Gulag into Komi's regional identity and into his own, while also presenting it as but one chapter of this lifelong experience. Another memoir author, Rimvidas Ratsanas, a Latvian man who was exiled to a special settlement in Komi as a boy, along with many other Baltic peoples following the Second World War, remembers the stigma that was attached to those of his social status as a special settler into exile. So Ratsanas's Gulag narrative complicates the formation of a regional identity and the collective memory of the Gulag, as he was sent to Komi not as a prisoner but as an exile, dumped into a village and just told, okay, live here, don't leave. You're in Komi now. So as a result of this, we sort of have a complication of the regional identity in this regional memorial archive as not just associated with the Gulag, but also special settlements and different nationalities who were sent to Komi, which form an important part of this, this greater narrative that I'm going to explore in my dissertation. Just to give you an example of this stigma that Ratsanas describes, he says, quote, "I lived in the Komi SSR. around Kotkaros for 17 years, from 1941 to 1958. A considerable period. As a 7-year-old, I started school and then later became a student in college and then graduated in forestry. It would seem that this is the usual way for many people, but all this time an invisible yoke hung over me, the stigma of a special settler. And this is another theme, stigma and fear that sort of litters Ratsanas's memoir, but it's another theme that I've seen in other memoirs, is that they interweave the stigma that hangs over them as part of the stigma of the history of the Gulag that sort of hangs over Komi. Okay, so we're going to run to the next part. Okay, so another important component of this expression, or the creation of a collective memory, an expression of regional identity tied to the Gulag, is the erection of monuments to political repression and the Gulag. But first, before we talk about this monument in particular, and then one other one really quickly, I'd like to share with you a few comments that sort of demonstrates the general knowledge of the Komi's history in the Gulag and its ties to one another. So roughly a year after the publication of the textbook that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, beginning of this paper, Komi's deputy to the State Duma, Rostislav Goldstein, told a Komi newspaper, "All of the Komi Republic is a big monument to the victims of political repression." Quote. This comment, which was made on October 30th, Russia's Day of Memory to the victims of political repression, is noteworthy because it builds on the narrative that Memorial has established using the memoirs and archival documents from the Komi National Archive. Also is significant because it is a comment made by a regional official at the same time that sort of the more national narrative is downplaying the existence of the Gulag or its role in the Soviet Union, development of the Soviet Union. Just to give you a greater sense of what Deputy Goldstein said, he said, quote, "Komi was literally embroiled in camps. The zone stretched for thousands of miles. Most of our northern towns and settlements are former places of exile. At the beginning of the last century, half of the population of Komi were prisoners. In 1939, the free population of the Komi ASSR was approximately 320,300 people. And the camp prisoner, or prisoner population he has in quotation marks, was 112,000 people. It was the repressed who built the coal mines, the oil fields, who logged, who built the railroad on the permafrost, and who were even the first in the country to start producing radium." So again, this is just another expression of public officials' recognition of the ties between Komi's national history and its public memory. So now this monument right here on the right is sort of a monument chapel that was erected in the year 2000 to commemorate victims of political repression and those who were sent into exile in the Gulag, into Komi. It is an official representation of the Gulag narrative and a site of memory. It is official because it is a state-endorsed representation. The monument is built in the style of a Russian Orthodox chapel, and I'll show you in a second what the artist who was commissioned to build this monument originally had in mind. I actually had a chance to see the original sort of figurine monument that didn't ever leave that sort of stage of production. However, the significance of this monument, in my mind, is that despite its prominence in this picture, it is located in a decentered area of town. It is close to the airport. It's on a side street, and if you didn't know where to look, you would never find it. And so, as such, it's a message that we can acknowledge the Gulag, we can acknowledge this history and its legacy. However, we can't do so in a way that is within the center of the public eye and the public's attention. For instance, Lenin still stands tall on the main square that is overlooked by the three main government buildings of the Komi Republic. So, and this monument to the victims of political repression is sort of put away in the corner, for those who know about it. And the other thing that you might observe about this monument is that it's cleverly disguised. At first look, you would think, okay, this is a nice little chapel to visit on the way to the airport, but it is not. It's actually a Gulag monument, and I'll show you. We'll wrap this up really quick. So the paneling on the inner walls is full of imagery, names of people, names of places, the different towns and cities in Komi that were associated with the camps. You'll have it that all the major cities were that were Gulag camps were actually listed here. This was the original monument that they were going to construct, but it was voted down. They said no. You see these two hulking, sort of totalitarian-looking figures, gargantuan men dragging away this smaller and helpless figure who's facing the other way. Okay, this is sort of to conclude really quick. This is another type of monument. It's an unofficial monument. However, it's mapped by the Memorial Project. There's a Memorial St. Petersburg project that maps locations online of different Gulag sites. And this one was actually marked and mapped by a man whose parents perished at this Lagpunkt, this campsite that was once attached to an invalid home, part of the Ustvimlag forced labor camp and special settlement. And as such, it's just simple or Orthodox cross, but the woods are, as you can see this, from this depression right here, there's mass graves throughout the entire woods from where bodies have decomposed over time, over the years. This is just another sort of example of the entrance to the area that is marked off, and the plaque explains that it is a burial site. So in conclusion, we have the complex construction of memory and regional identity within the preservation of Gulag returnee narratives and memoirs, and their preservation in a Komi memorial archive, which contributes to the formation of regional identity that pushes back against the center, although in an unforceful way. All right. Thank you.